The Battle of Jena came 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great. The crash will come 20 years after my departure, if things go on like this. These words were spoken by Otto von Bismarck, Duke of Lauenburg, Prussian statesman, and Chancellor of the German Empire, in his final discussion with Kaiser Wilhelm in 1895. Bismarck drew a parallel between the empire of Frederick the Great and its decline and collapse with the German Empire of his day. He predicted that within 20 years of his death, the German Empire would collapse. Otto von Bismarck died on July 30th, 1898. On the 9th of November, 1918, the German Empire collapsed under the weight of war exhaustion and a workers' revolution. Bismarck's prediction was only 3 months off. By the summer of 1914, the July crisis had begun following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo on June 28th of that year. As I'm sure you've heard me say at least 10 different times by now, the assassination triggered a web of alliances and a build-up of militarism and nationalism which had been brewing since the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions of 1848. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Germany was a rising industrial and military power, but one deeply anxious about its position in Europe. Sandwiched between France to the west and Russia to the east, with the seemingly hostile British guarding the North Sea and tying down any colonial ambitions they had, Germany's military and political leadership increasingly felt surrounded by hostile forces. It thus formed an alliance with former rival Austria, formalized in 1879, which quickly became central to its foreign policy. But the alliance was as much a burden as a shield. Austria-Hungary was a fragile empire, struggling to maintain control over its multi-ethnic population, and any sane politician in that time could see that war was on the horizon. The concert of Europe, which had effectively existed since the Congress of Vienna in 1814, was showing cracks. The Balkan Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, the naval arms race, the Moroccan crises, and the rise of Pan-Slavism and French revanchism all pointed towards war on the continent, which would inevitably involve the major powers due to the intersecting of alliances formed during the long 19th century. Germany's leadership, particularly Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and the military high command, believed that time was not on their side. Russia's ongoing industrialization and military reforms threatened to tip the balance of power in Eastern Europe, meaning that if Germany wanted to keep their eastern flank safe, time was running thin. On top of that, France's enduring resentment over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 kept tensions high on Germany's western border. It was, within this context of insecurity, that Germany made a very fateful decision during the July crisis. After Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo, alarm bells rung out in the upper circles of most every European nation. Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas bypassed their diplomatic channels and began exchanging personal telegrams attempting to prevent war, while Austria-Hungary's leadership wanted to punish Serbia, whose nationalist movement was believed to have inspired the attack. But Austria didn't have the ability to do so yet. For starters, much of their standing army was away on harvest leave, and they were also worried about Russia sweeping in and defending Serbia. Russia believed itself to be the protector of Orthodox Southern Slavs, and this was compounded by Russian failures in the aftermath of the First Balkan War. After the First Balkan War was over and the Orthodox powers had beaten the Ottomans, Russia supported the formation of a Balkan League, an extension of this pan-Slavic sentiment to a degree, but it did not anticipate how quickly its Balkan allies would actually turn against each other. Bulgaria, Russia's preferred ally, attacked Serbia and Greece in 1913, leading to the Second Balkan War. Russia did not intervene decisively when Bulgaria was defeated, which not only damaged Russia's reputation, but also led Bulgaria to drift towards Germany and Austria-Hungary for support. By 1914, this diplomatic failure had haunted Nicholas II. Serbia was now Russia's effective only remaining strong Balkan ally, and allowing it to be crushed by Russia would have shattered Russian influence in the region. On top of that, Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, faced pressure from pan-Slavists in the Duma, or parliament, and already had a taste of revolutionary fervor after Bloody Sunday in 1905. Austria knew this. They knew Russia would enter the war if given the opportunity, due to all of these pressures upon them. And thus, Austria understood that they needed a backup plan before they could press Serbia for major concessions and then escalate to war. Now, not all in Austria-Hungary wanted war with Serbia. In fact, the Hungarians were mostly opposed to it, and many within Austria viewed it as suicidal, but a very influential minority were highly in favor of beating down the Serbs and presumably ensuring Austrian omnipotence in the Balkans. These war hawks were ostensibly led by Austrian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf. Regardless, on July 5, 1914, Austria-Hungary's ambassador to the German Empire met with Kaiser Wilhelm II and Chancellor Hollweg in Berlin. The Austrians wanted to gauge how far Germany would support them in any confrontation with Serbia, and as we alluded to, a fateful decision was made. Wilhelm and Bethmann Hollweg offered what has become known as the blank check, unconditional German support for whatever actions Austria-Hungary decided to take. Wilhelm believed that this assurance would strengthen Austria-Hungary's resolve and allow it to deal a decisive diplomatic blow to Serbia without escalating the conflict further. However, that assumption was the complete opposite of what happened. They overestimated Austria-Hungary's ability to act swiftly and also underestimated the likelihood of Russian intervention and the speed with which Russia would mobilize. The German military establishment, led by Helmut von Moltke the Younger, chief of the General Staff, further pushed for decisive action once the blank check was offered. Moltke and his staff were prepared for a war that they believed was inevitable. They stated that France would use the Franco-Russian alliance in order to try to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, which, to their credit, they were right about. They also, though, called for early mobilization and for a rapid offensive against France through Belgium, followed by a pivot to the Eastern Front to confront Russia. This plan left no room for flexibility. Once mobilization truly began, it could not be stopped. On July 23rd, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding sweeping concessions that they knew would be unacceptable. When Serbia responded with a counter-proposal that conceded to most demands but resisted certain points which might indict the Serbian government, including handing the investigation over to Austria, the Austrians saw their chance. Kaiser Wilhelm wrote saying, "A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it all reason for war falls apart." But the Austrians disagreed. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th. Russia began mobilization to defend Serbia. Wilhelm tried to broker peace, now fearful of what might come of Austria's actions. On July 29th, he urged Austria to halt its advance and offered to mediate peace talks before fighting actually broke out. However, the momentum of mobilization and Germany's military class's readiness for war made de-escalation at this point nearly impossible. The generals moved troops in order to enact the Stolypin plan. Germany declared war on August 1st, marching through the Benelux to France. This was a violation of Belgian neutrality and brought Britain into the war, as it had guaranteed Belgium's independence under the 1939 Treaty of London. What had begun as a localized conflict in Bosnia had now spiraled into a full-scale European war. The tragedy of the July crisis is that none of the great powers truly sought a general war, yet all were drawn into it by a combination of misjudgments, rigid military plans, and the pressures of alliance commitments. Germany, believing that it was acting defensively, found itself cast as the aggressor, and its invasion of Belgium cemented its role in at least the eyes of the Western world. The war that followed would not only devastate Europe, but also shatter the old order, ushering in an era of revolution, disillusionment, and radical political change. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Germans refused to intervene when Austria declared war? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider joining the channel, like our first and current member, Eaglefall. You can also submit a scenario in our official Discord server, linked below. Anyway, thanks, and enjoy the video. If we assume that the blank check is never offered, and thus Austria-Hungary never gets the reassurances it wanted from Germany, war probably wouldn't break out over the July crisis. Austria would probably soften its ultimatum, increasing the chances that Serbia would accept and thereby preserving peace in the short term. Alternatively, it could take up Britain's offer to mediate the dispute, potentially saving face, but failing to avenge the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Either of these options would delay a general European war, but not indefinitely, as the Balkan powder keg remained, and another crisis would inevitably arise. But for the sake of our scenario, why don't we assume Austria-Hungary actually chooses the third path? It declares war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, gambling that Germany will fall in line once events are set into motion. This would, of course, be a catastrophic miscalculation. Austria declaring war without a blank check would essentially be their end. Serbia, already expecting an invasion, would appeal to its obvious patron, Russia. Nicholas II, unwilling to repeat the humiliation of the Balkan Wars and fearful of another failure to act which would permanently cripple Russian influence in the region, would order mobilization. This time, we'd actually see Wilhelm II privately assure Nicholas that Germany will not intervene so long as the conflict remained between Russia, Serbia, and Austria, with Nicholas passing this down the chain of command to the delight of his military generals. The Franco-Russian alliance, therefore, would remain dormant. France, for the sake of this scenario, would understand that this is not yet their war, and therefore would not mobilize. What would follow would not be a world war, but rather a doomed regional conflict. Deprived of German military backing, Austria-Hungary has effectively entered this regional war in an incredibly weak position. Its forces, already linguistically divided and undertrained, mostly composed of farmer peasants who are wholly unprepared for a prolonged conflict against Russia, would by August see Russian armies surge into Galicia and become wholly overwhelmed. The Battle of Lemberg, which in our timeline was a hard-fought engagement that resulted in a Russian victory, would now turn into an outright rout of Russian forces. Entire Austrian divisions would collapse under Russian pressure, and by September, Russian forces would be threatening Budapest itself. The Hungarian government, wary of being dragged down by the increasingly desperate Habsburg leadership, would begin illegally seeking a separate peace with Russia. Budapest's politicians would make a secret appeal to St. Petersburg, hoping to negotiate Hungary's independence in exchange for withdrawing from the war. Nicholas II, of course seeing the strategic advantage of literally breaking the Austro-Hungarian state apart, would signal his willingness to negotiate. By the early months of 1915, Austria-Hungary would no longer be a functional empire. The Hungarian parliament would formally declare independence, leaving the Austrians to fend for themselves. Without German support, and with its forces disintegrating, Austria would be forced to sue for peace. The collapse of Austria-Hungary will trigger a wave of huge realignments, mostly in the Balkans, and Russia will be effectively allowed to unilaterally dictate the terms in the post-war settlement. Hungary would of course be granted its independence. It would not become a Russian satellite, but without an empire to sustain it, it would be left in a precarious position. Much like Italy in the post-Napoleonic era, a second-rate power trapped between stronger neighbors. On top of that, Hungary would be forced to continue to carry out Magyarization without the reinforcement of Vienna. This might lead Hungary to come to be reliant on either Germany or Russia for its stability, though we'll have to see in the coming years. Bohemia and Moravia will be established as an independent Czech state, herein Nicholas II making a calculated concession. Bohemia will be allowed to drift into the German economic sphere, a gesture of goodwill to Berlin for their neutrality in the war, and a personal thanks to Kaiser Wilhelm. Bosnia and Herzegovina will be merged into Serbia, now fully and formally backed by Russia. Something of a greater Serbia, under Russian influence, would thus begin to take shape. Italy would probably be granted Trentino and Trieste, as a means to court the Italians into Russian goodwill and ensure Russian access to the Mediterranean. Nicholas's great plan would now be to forge a means of protecting Russian power through Romania and Serbia into the Adriatic and hopefully the Mediterranean, with Russian merchants gaining the ability to establish companies at friendly warm water ports in Serbia. Italy would be strategically important in this greater plan, especially if Britain begins to drift away from supporting Russia following this realignment of power. Speaking of a realignment, with Austria out of the picture, Russia would now pretty much become the undisputed master of the Balkans, discounting perhaps Bulgaria and Greece. We'd probably see Russian advisors flood the government of Serbia, and also an attempt by Nicholas to reign in Bulgaria, though it's highly likely that Bulgaria will just still cozy up to Germany in the coming years, just given that it's effectively surrounded on all sides by Russian satellites and has no room to expand without Russian distrust, especially now that Serbia is the favorite son, so to speak. Albania will probably be partitioned in the coming years. They were already at war with the Greeks, a war which Russia would want to end. The northern half, largely Catholic, would probably fall under Italian influence in the coming years, while the south, predominantly Muslim and Hellenic, would find themselves nominally independent but under Russian watch. This action would probably push Greece out of Russia's orbit, likely into the hands of the British, who were their main backer anyway. Germany would end up in a far less favorable position. The Germans had spent decades cultivating Austria-Hungary as its most reliable ally. With Vienna and Budapest effectively erased from the strategic equation, Berlin would have no meaningful continental partner. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and still regarded as the sick man of Europe, was hardly a replacement. Italy, though opportunistic, would be no better. For the German general staff, this situation was a nightmare realized. The Stolypin plan, a two-front war against France and Russia, had now pretty much been inverted. Instead of being surrounded by enemies, Germany was fully isolated. The balance of power had turned decisively in favor of Russia, which now projected influence directly into Central Europe. But Germany did have one card to play, and that was Britain. For decades, Britain and Germany had been fierce rivals, competing for industrial dominance, colonial influence, and naval supremacy. But in this new world, the British would have to consider their grand strategy carefully. London had always sought to maintain the balance of power in Europe, preventing any single power from growing strong enough to dominate the continent. With Russia's rise and its newfound position as the arbiter of the Balkans, Britain now faced an uncomfortable truth. It might have more to fear from Russia than from Germany. The British were thus far at least cordial with Russia due to the Franco-Russian alliance, and because Russia was the greatest threat to Germany, who was close to outcompeting Britain in terms of industrial capabilities. But now Russia was the threat to concert Europe, with the Great Game still tentatively going on in Central Asia, and Tsar Nicholas's eyes presumably on the Ottomans and possibly even the Suez. Both the British and Germans would have no choice other than to accept this reality and try to make a pivot toward the other. But economic and naval tensions would essentially be a huge, lumbering roadblock in the way of such an action. The Germans would be forced to make calculated concessions, perhaps scaling back Admiral Tippett's naval ambitions, which had antagonized the British. With this, the Germans might actually signal to the British a willingness to slow their hostility and focus instead on land-based defense strategies in light of Russia's ascent. Britain, for its part, was deeply reluctant to abandon its long-standing suspicion of Germany. The scars of commercial rivalries in China and Africa still ran deep. However, realpolitik would undoubtedly prevail. Germany had strategic alliances in the Balkans with Bulgaria and ostensibly a relationship with the Ottoman Turks against Russian expansion. Still, Germany was also the only power that could truly serve as a secondary threat to Russia besides the British Empire herself. The British Foreign Office would have to recognize that an unchecked Russia posed a greater existential threat to Britain's global position than a further weakened Germany. British liberal statesmen had never fully trusted the autocratic Romanovs anyway, and with St. Petersburg now dancing a new political waltz across the Balkans, Britain would kind of be forced to follow through. Diplomatic conferences would come to be held between the British, Germans, and French. France, however, would not take this shift lightly. France had spent decades investing in its pact with Russia. The Franco-Russian alliance, built on mutual hostility towards Germany, had been the cornerstone of French foreign policy since the 1890s. But France was also closely tied to Britain, and relied on them for naval reinforcement in the event of war on the continent. Some in Paris were uneasy with Russia's unchecked expansion, but many French revanchists were still hell-bent on destroying Germany. If Britain now leaned towards Germany in an effort to counterbalance Russian ambitions, where did it leave France? France would likely align itself with Russia, severing its strategic alliance with the British and leaving Britain more open to German military expansion to counterbalance this change. We might also see Britain become more open to another shift in the balance of power because of this French realignment. The German-speaking population of Austria, stripped of its former empire, was now small and vulnerable. Austrian nationalists, many of whom had harbored resentment toward Berlin for failing to back them in the war, would begin to consider their stance. The economic devastation caused by the empire's collapse made integration with Germany an attractive option. This prospect of German annexation of Austria was met with furious protest in Paris, though it was becoming increasingly clear that Britain would be willing to tolerate such an outcome to maintain equilibrium. Some in Germany began advocating for a Großdeutschland, a unification of all German-speaking peoples. This was far more politically tenable in Germany compared to other European states, as Germany had been more of a political concept than a nation for most of its history, and many still had more patriotism for their region, Saxons, Prussians, Bavarians, etc., than for the German Empire as a whole. The prospect of an annexation of Austria into Germany would thus quickly become a real possibility, and a real pragmatic one at that. By the late 1910s or early 1920s, Austria might actually likely voluntarily join Germany. Beyond these geopolitical changes, however, there is a nation which would be on an unlikely rebound from the crisis as a result of the war. For the first time in his troubled reign, Nicholas II was triumphant. The war with Austria-Hungary had ended not in humiliation, as the Russo-Japanese War had a decade prior, but in a total victory. Russian troops swept through Galicia, humbled the Habsburgs, and dismantled one of Europe's great empires. The Slavic dream had been realized. Serbia stood empowered in something of a Yugoslavia, and the Balkans had been bent to Russia's will. St. Petersburg effectively dictated the future of Eastern Europe. Nicholas, however, was still Nicholas. Victory had not changed the fundamental character of the man who ruled over an empire stretching from the Carpathians to the Pacific. He remained deeply, sometimes cripplingly idealistic, and devoted to the divine right of the Romanovs, weary of any reforms that might loosen his grip on power and simultaneously easily swayed by his sometimes ill-intended or ill-informed advisors. Don't get me wrong, I love Tsar Nicholas as a historical character, and from what I've read, he seemed like a genuinely kind and honorable man, but often an honorable man is not a great leader, especially in a nation as unique politically and developmentally as the massive Russian Empire. Russia was still a nation of peasants, bound to outdated agricultural systems, and an industrial latecomer trying to compete with the economic powerhouses of Britain and Germany, and also a country whose political structure remained decades behind its European counterparts. But war had bought him time. Unlike in our timeline, where Russia was battered by the grueling attrition of World War I, and especially without the release of Vladimir Lenin into Russia by the Germans, there would be no coherent, organized revolution against the Tsardom, either from the military or from the Bolsheviks, who wouldn't exist anyway. But there still would be an irritation at the incompetence of the regime. It might be in this political climate that we see Russia undergo a sort of Prussian-style period of political development. There was only one man who had ever come close to modernizing Russia without toppling the Romanov system, and that man was Pyotr Stolypin. The prime minister had once promised Nicholas that he could secure the empire's future if given 20 years of peace. In this timeline, Stolypin, or at least his policies, would be given the chance to define the Russian state. Stolypin's reforms had already laid the groundwork for a new Russia, but he was assassinated in 1911 by revolutionaries. His agricultural policies sought to create a class of independent landowning peasants, later referred to as the kulaks, who would form the backbone of a stable Russian society. His Bismarckian crackdown on revolutionary movements had been brutal but effective, and his vision for Russia's industrial expansion could now be pursued without the constraints of a devastating world war. But since he was assassinated before even the war, the question becomes who would carry on this vision and successfully modernize Russia? The answer might actually be closer to the heart than we think. Count Vladimir Kokovtsov served as Prime Minister of Russia from 1911 after Stolypin's death to 1914 when he was dismissed by Tsar Nicholas for not being able to control the press. Kokovtsov and Nicholas didn't really get along that well. In 1912, Kokovtsov asked Tsar Nicholas to exile Rasputin, and Nicholas refused. However, I do believe that if, for the sake of the scenario, we prevent his dismissal, Russia might stand a chance in the coming years. If we presume that Kokovtsov continues his time as prime minister, he might be able to court Nicholas's favor, as his reforms would begin to stabilize the political situation. The peasant communes, or the mir, would be dismantled in favor of private land ownership. Railroads would be extended across the empire, and state investment in industry would surge as Russia sought to modernize. The key to stability was economic growth. Kokovtsov would push for a rapid expansion of Russian industry, seeking to transform the empire into an economic peer to Germany or Britain. State-driven investment, guided by figures like Sergei Witt and a new generation of industrialists, would accelerate the development of factories, railroads, and mining operations. Yet industrialization obviously brought its own dangers. The expansion of Russia's urban centers would swell the ranks of the working class, intensifying demands for better wages, improved conditions, and greater political rights. The Tsarist regime thus faced a fundamental paradox. Modernizing the economy would strengthen the empire in the short term, but in the long term it could produce an urbanized, industrialized population far less willing to tolerate the Tsar's rule. In Prussia, the solution was social welfare and suppression of dissent. That might be the solution for Kokovtsov's Russia. But in an empire as massive as Russia, it would be difficult to implement equally or prevent abuse of the welfare system. Already in the Russian Empire, there were scattered state interventions to provide social protection, primarily though social welfare boards established by the government, which focused on aiding the poor, widows, and orphans, particularly through almshouses and workhouses. However, the scope of this assistance was very limited and largely reliant on philanthropy from the upper classes and the church. A solution for the conservative Nicholas might be to tie workers' rights hand in hand with the responsibilities of the Russian church. Besides this, however, Russia's greatest political experiment, the Duma, would continue to be a thorn in Nicholas's side. The parliament, first established after the revolution of 1905, had been neutered by Nicholas's resistance to the genuine constitutionalist movement in Russia. He dissolved the first two Dumas when they proved too radical for his taste, and his government had rigged the electoral system to ensure that the third and fourth Dumas were packed with conservatives and monarchists. However, with industrial acceleration and an expansion of the middle class, demands for political reform would inevitably grow louder. The emerging Russian bourgeois class, businessmen, factory owners, and educated professionals would, as they had in other European polities, seek greater influence in government. If Nicholas refused to grant it, unrest would be inevitable. Here, the role of reformers like Kokovtsov becomes a crucial one once again. If a strong pragmatic prime minister could convince Nicholas to grant limited constitutional concessions, perhaps expanding the power of the Duma without surrendering full autocratic control, Russia might have evolved into a semi-constitutional monarchy akin to a more heavily authoritarian Britain of sorts. Still, the nobility, whose vast estates still dominated the countryside, would fight against any measures that threatened their privileged position. But even still, if land reform was pursued aggressively, the Russian peasantry might have been transformed into a loyal, property-owning class that saw the Tsar as their benefactor. For the sake of our scenario, we'll make another assumption and say that these reforms are slowly implemented and Nicholas II warms up to the idea of small concessions to maintain stability and preserve his regime. And things might actually work out well for Russia in the long term. So the world had settled, for now, into an uneasy balance. The old concert order, wrecked by Austria-Hungary's downfall, had given way to a new fragile alignment of powers. Russia and France stood at the head of one bloc, with Russian influence stretching from the Balkans to the Adriatic, while Britain and Germany, former rivals now bound by a necessary détente, held a precarious counterweight. The scars of the last war were still fresh, at least in the Balkans, but beneath the surface, tensions were rising. Old resentments had not faded. They had merely been redrawn along different borders. And as history had proven time and time again, the peace of Europe had never been anything more than an intermission between conflicts. The Balkans, as ever, were a breeding ground for discontent. Russia's ascendance had turned Serbia into a regional powerhouse, the dominant force south of the Carpathians, but its expansion had not come without consequences. Bulgaria, under these conditions, was left with no recourse but to align with Berlin. And on top of that, Bulgarian nationalists seethed at the idea of Serbian hegemony over lands they believed to be their own. That being Macedonia, a volatile mix of Serbs, Bulgarians, and Greeks, which was essentially an open sore in the Balkans, one that both Sofia and Belgrade laid claim to. It was in this borderland among the rival nationalists and secret societies that the inevitable tragedy would begin to unfold. The immediate crisis would not actually come from Bulgaria or Serbia, however, it would come from Hungary. Hungary had been granted its independence in the wake of Austria-Hungary's collapse, but it had not emerged unscathed. It was now a diminished state, overshadowed by its more powerful neighbors, and without the resources to continue Magyarization. Budapest had fallen under Russian influence by necessity, but the Hungarians had not forgotten the terms imposed upon them. They resented their dependence on St. Petersburg, and they resented even more the growing power of Serbia to their south. The Magyar elite feared that Serbia, backed by the Russian bear, would not stop at Bosnia, that it would continue to push northward, stirring up the restless Slavic populations of Hungarian Croatia. Already, Serbian-backed agitators were active in the Banat and Vojvodina, pushing for autonomy, whispering of annexation. And so, Hungary made a new fateful decision. In the summer of 1931, the Hungarian government, led by Prime Minister István Bethlen, moved to suppress Serbian nationalist movements within its own borders. Political clubs were banned, newspapers were shut down, activists were arrested. But the real flashpoint came when the Hungarians raided a Serbian paramilitary group in Subotica, uncovering a weapons cache linked to a secretive nationalist group known as the Narodna Obrana, the People's Defense, an organization with ties not just to Greater Serbia, but to the Serbian government itself. The fallout was immediate. Belgrade denied any involvement, but fearing that Serbia was actively working to destabilize Hungary, the Hungarian government ordered a series of military deployments along the southern border. In response, Serbian forces were put on high alert. Russia could not ignore the provocation. Nicholas II issued a letter to Budapest: withdraw the troops or face the consequences. Bulgaria began to move troops to its border with Serbia, causing a second wave of letters to both Budapest and Sofia. The situation from there deteriorated rapidly. Within several weeks, skirmishes broke out in Macedonia, where Bulgarian soldiers allegedly fired on Serbian border guards. The details were murky, the reports were conflicting, but the effect was immediate. Serbia declared that Hungarian and Bulgarian aggression could not go unanswered. Bulgaria called for assistance. Germany and Britain entered the war. If Hungary or Bulgaria fell, it would set a precedent, one that could not be allowed to continue. France saw this as their opportunity and pledged military support for Russia in order to attain a casus belli for war over Alsace-Lorraine. By the end of the month, mobilizations were in full effect. This was no longer a skirmish between border guards. This was something far more dangerous. This was the beginning of a second European war. And this time, there would be no illusions of a quick or limited conflict. Europe, once again, stood on the precipice. And that's where I'll be ending this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.